Welcome back to the OIS podcast with Dr. Asan Sadri. This week, we had the pleasure of speaking with Todd Brady, who is an MDPhD turned VCEIR turned CEO of Aldera. Let's hear Todd talk about his experience as a real-life apprentice.
Hi, everybody. This is Asan Sadri. I'm a board-certified ophthalmologist here in Newport Beach, California. And for those of you who may or may not be listening to our podcast at OIS here, we generally like to bring in the innovation and experts in the next sort of unmet needs. The other sort of hat I wear is I'm also involved with Visionary Ventures here located in Orange County. I was a general partner, and also I'm a co-founder. And so, I'm absolutely intrigued to have Todd Brady, who is the fearless leader of Aldera here, visiting us today. How you doing, Todd?
Great. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. And, what we do at OIS Podcast is really bring the unmet needs and also the entrepreneurs, CEO leaders, and sort of dive in and talk about your background and your company. For those people who haven't heard about you, maybe give us a little background of what led you to become involved in eye care and ophthalmology, and we can start from there.
Aldera as a company was founded in 2004, in fact, and out of Harvard by a retinal group. And so the initial days of the company were really based on working on retinal disease. In fact, in the early days, it was just an idea around a novel pharmaceutical target that we call RASP, which stands for reactive aldehyde species. And, venture capitalists don't really fund companies like this anymore, but truly back of the napkin. In fact, I used to say we couldn't even afford the napkin. But we did raise institutional financing in 2005 from Domain Associates, where I was a principal at that time, and then Johnson & Johnson Development Corporation, which is the venture arm of Johnson & Johnson. And I think the first financing, believe it or not, for Aldera was a $500,000 seed loan, which converted many years later into a Series A round. The company historically has always been based on the eye because of that initial group at Harvard that was focused on the relationship of RASP to retinal disease. And we've continued working on the eye. We've sort of fast forward development to the front of the eye because it was a little easier to test. The conditions it didn't require injections into the eye or oral administration. With these anterior segment diseases, you could administer drug topically with eye drops. For us, that made more sense. So we are now in phase 3 in dry eye disease. We're in phase 3 in allergic conjunctivitis, but we've maintained that retinal interest and now have since in-licensed ADX2191, which is an injectable drug for treatment of proliferative vitreoretinopathy, which is a retinal disease. And we have now our own RASP program for retinal disease, which I hope will be in the clinic in the next year or two. So we've traditionally been focused around the eye. Now, more recently, we developed an oral RASP inhibitor, ADX629, which will be used to treat systemic inflammatory diseases. We're starting out psoriasis and asthma, and with luck, we'll get a COVID trial up soon. So the company has really sort of grown, if you will, from the back of the eye to the front of the eye, and now I think systemically with the program. And I think one of the reasons for that is the initial target, RASP, really applies broadly throughout the body. RASP are implicated in inflammatory diseases, and many diseases have some sort of component of inflammation. Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer now is an inflammatory disease, right? Too little inflammation.
Yeah, I saw that you're involved in the ovarian cancer, right?
That's right. We in-licensed another product that is sort of a broad immune modulating product, especially where there's hyperproliferation of immune cells. ADX1612 is the name of that product. And And, proliferation is all about cancer. And so the former owner of the asset had numerous cancer programs. And one of those that sort of left over was ovarian cancer. And that trial should be reading out, in a year or so. So a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of different approaches, different diseases. But we believe in that in Aldera. I think in biotech, it's dangerous to put all your eggs in one basket, to run one trial in one disease with one asset. Instead, we have a sort of a shots on goal approach at Aldera. And we're thrilled about RASP in particular because it applies, as I said, so broadly across numerous diseases.
So tell me about that, because this is an interesting. I know your background. You were at Duke, right? And then you studied pathology, and then before that you were at Dartmouth. And what made you go into ophthalmology?
Yeah, I've always liked ophthalmology simply because the eye is sort of a model in a way for the rest of the body. You think about all kinds of diseases that affect the eye: infectious disease, cancer, vascular disease, genetic diseases, and yet the eye is so accessible. As you mentioned, topically you can bathe the eye in drug, you can inject drug right into the eye, and it's sort of this self-contained unit. So we're because of that, I think we're one of the first companies to really start in the eye and expand systemically, if you will. I think you see a lot of the opposite. You see a lot of companies developing drugs elsewhere and then saying, well, why don't we try them in the eye? Cyclosporin is a great example of that. So in terms of background, I studied in graduate school. I studied oxidative toxicology, primarily nitric oxide, superoxide dismutase. My challenge there was that those toxins are very short-lived. They're extremely reactive. And when we happened upon this company, when I was in Domain, we happened upon the beginnings of Aldera, what fascinated me was here we had a toxin that was sort of long-lived. RASP or aldehydes are much more stable. They're sort of broadly active throughout the body. They're really, in a way, sort of potent, long-lived second messengers that are a bit like small molecule cytokines or leukotrienes or other kinds of inflammatory mediators. Yet, no one had ever worked on them in terms of sequestering them or inhibiting them. And we seem to be the first company focused on that. So for us, I think it's an exciting opportunity, to say the least.
Yeah, and it's incredible because you've been there for a long time. You've been there since 2012, I think. Is that what I read on your website? And it was just remarkable because a lot of entrepreneurs, that we have on and is in the market just sort of do something and then they move on. And so it's kind of interesting that you stayed on and kind of now have worked on different sort of shots on goal. What excites you right now? Give us an update. What's going on with the company? I know you're in different disease states. If you were to force rank, what would you force rank top to bottom and then why?
Well, the greatest focus of late on the company has been on the dry eye disease program. Obviously, of the diseases we've talked about today, dry eye disease is sort of the most popular among investors, the most popular among physicians and patients and so forth because of the unmet medical need. I mean, here we have something 30-odd million patients in the United States. Very few of them are treated. For Restasis and Xiidra, which are sort of the two classic drugs to treat the disease, most of those patients last a few months on therapy, if that. 60% discontinuation rates and so forth. So it's sort of a disaster in terms of unmet medical need for dry eye disease. And I think because of that, we've gotten a lot of interest in that particular program. And most recently, we've met with the FDA about the remainder of our phase 3 program. We've posted positive symptom results in 2 trials and 3 trials.
I saw that.
Phase 2B program. So we're absolutely thrilled about that. I went to the FDA, and the FDA said, okay, for your sign, the FDA requires a symptom and a sign for approval. And for your sign, you can use RASP, which is amazing for us, right? Because the way the drugs work, the RASP inhibitors work, is they bind chemically. So one molecule of drug binds covalently to another molecule of RASP. And so, in a sense, what the FDA said is you can follow that chemical reaction in tears, for example, or in some other way in a patient, and that can be your endpoint, which is amazing because it validates the company, it validates the platform, it validates the target. For us, it should be relatively easy to do. And so that's the huge news recently, and I think there's been a lot of interest in the company because of that.
So when you heard that, are you now entering phase 3? Is that ongoing now?
Right. So what we've announced is that we're going to run 2 phase 3 sign trials to demonstrate changes in effective signs for dry eye disease. And the trials themselves will last somewhere between 2 and 28 days. And the reason for that range is it depends on how you measure RASP. So you can measure RASP acutely, that is levels of RASP using mass spec, for example. Or you can measure changes in RASP over time with an ELISA. And what the ELISA measures is levels of bound RASP. So as you know, the ELISA is an antibody-based approach. One of the problems in disease is you have RASP floating around, they bind to proteins, and all of a sudden your immune system recognizes that protein as foreign, and you generate autoantibodies, and which are sort of characteristic of the classic characteristic of autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, these autoantibodies, or lupus autoantibodies, same thing. RASP are implicated in that. In fact, RASP-bound proteins have been described in those diseases. So therefore, one can use an ELISA to measure, or an antibody-based approach to measure bound RASP. Now, it's interesting the interplay between free RASP and bound RASP. Free RASP, occur acutely as a result of inflammation, very early on in the inflammatory cascade. We like to say pre-cytokine. So one of the earliest experiments we did was we used these RASP inhibitors, and we thought, okay, can we inhibit allergic inflammation? Can we inhibit autoimmune inflammation, or so-called Th1 cytokines, and Th2 cytokines in allergy, or Th17 cytokines, which are sort of autoimmune and cytokine release syndrome and so forth. So what we found was, yes, all of the above works. So RAS sort of sit upstream of cytokines. They're a very acute marker of disease and inflammation. And if you go to PubMed and you type in your favorite autoimmune disease and a RASP, such as malondialdehyde or hydroxynonenal, you'll find tens of thousands of papers. I did it the other day. I typed in malondialdehyde, and I think I got 60-something thousand papers. So these are clearly defined markers. The aha behind Aldera is no one's ever thought of inhibiting these compounds as inflammatory mediators. And I think we're seeing the beneficial effects of that now with therapy. So we have acute RASP, which can be measured by LCMS. We have a sort of chronic effects of bound RASP, which can be measured by ELISA. And that's the reason for the 2 to 28-day range for the trials. We'll start 2 of them. We're hoping to have initial results by the end of the year. Of course, all that depends on assay development, and it depends on COVID, and it depends on enrollment and trial design and so forth. But these are probably not very long term. As you know, 28 days is not a long trial in dry eye disease. So whatever the case, we're looking forward to a fairly efficient development path going forward.
Very good. So I like what you're doing. You're in allergy. You're in back of the eye. You're doing systemic. Let's back up. I want to learn a little bit more about. So you're MD-PhD because you're a scientist, right? You're a basic science guy. You love pathology. You love the eye space because it's really a nice petri dish, which is what that's why I did it, because everything's right there. You don't have to do any scans. Everything's right there. And for us, clinicians that I still have a day job, we actually make people see better, it's just an unbelievable treat. But for you, who taught you how to run a company? I mean, you're classically trained as an MD, PhD. Did you just kind of fall into it? Because I noticed you were, on a board, and you kind of gotten probably some osmotic knowledge that way. But what do you tell a young guy who's MD, PhD, and has the Entrepreneurial Book? Where do they learn how to run a company?
I think it is an apprenticeship, more or less. So what happened in my case is when I started graduate school, and this is a long time ago, so this is in the early 90s. Biotech was a very new thing, but the principal investigator of the lab, my thesis advisor, started a biotech company. And at that point, it was unheard of. I mean, we all sort of looked at it like, oh, we want to be involved in this, right? Because it was sort of toxic in a way, or taboo, where no one really did this. And there was sort of this notion that industry was poison in a way. It's really poisoned the true academic nature of research and so forth. So at first, none of us really were excited by it. And I in particular found it sort of peripheral at best to what we were trying to do in the lab and so forth. But over time, I got really interested in it because in and out of the lab were venture capitalists, investment bankers, consultants, the people that actually worked at the companies, and so forth. And it was, to me, very interesting, that whole ecosystem that surrounds the development of a novel drug. It's not just a scientist with test tubes and beakers.
No.
It's not at all that.
Right.
So, I mean, as you know, based on your venture work, it really does require this large group of semi-disparate entities that come together and get a drug to market. And so I just became very, very interested. And I had a friend that lived near me, and she said, you know what you should do? You should network. And I said, what's networking? What do you? And she said, that means meeting other people, and you ask them for 2 or 3 other people. So the advice I give folks is, if you're interested in business or the business side of medicine or drug development or biotech or pharma, whatever it is, go talk to people and ask those people for 2 or 3 other people to talk to. And so I kept a record of this in grad school, and I talked to about 100 in my spare time. And what I figured out I really wanted to do, at least for a little while after graduating from the PhD program, was venture capital. So I spent about 2 years in venture capital right after I graduated. And I thought, okay, am I going to do this, or am I going to then go do a residency and fellowship, and you know the drill, right? Yeah. And
meanwhile, you're like, you're a grad student, so you're not making any money. So you're like, your family, everybody, whoever's with you is like, dude, what the hell are you doing over here? Like, let's make some money. I mean, like, what, right? I mean,
it was crazy. I remember my wife looking at me thinking, what are you doing? Yeah. And especially back then, like, this just wasn't done.
Yeah. It was unconventional.
It was unconventional. So what I decided to do was think about it carefully. And a young company had just come into our VC fund where I was at the time. And we couldn't fund them. They were too early. But I was very excited about the technology. So I actually left the first VC firm, joined the startup. I had no salary with that startup. I had some options and maybe some warrants and so forth. And eventually I got paid. But it was an amazing time. Fortunately, my wife had a job, so I didn't have any kids, and I was able to do that. Ran that company eventually. Got to run that company, and then we sold it to another company. We're back to venture for another 10 years or so at Domain Associates, which was at the time one of the largest in all this healthcare VC funds, which is where we saw Aldera. In fact, Aldera was my first investment back in 2005. So I've been on the board since 2005 and moved from sort of principal to entrepreneur in residence in 2012, which is when I became CEO of this company. And I tell people it only took me until I was about 40 to figure out that what I really enjoyed doing was creating companies and running those companies. I love the investment side, as I'm sure you do. I think it's fun. Yeah. It's thrilling to talk to entrepreneurs and smart people and deal with new technologies and think about the future and imagine and so forth. But I felt I also wanted to get my hands dirtier and actually build things myself. And that's how I wound up back on the operating side at Aldera.
Very good. So for those of you listening, there's a lot there. There's so much there. There's apprenticeship, right? So you just don't kind of just jump. You got to go in-house, into the tent. Someone's got to take you underneath their wing. What I also loved about your story is you're following your heart, really, right? At the end of the day, you have an open mind, and you're here you are with the MDPhD. I mean, it's hard because now you're like vested in this big training. You didn't just do the MD, you did the PhD, and you're like, dude, I got to pay for all this stuff, all these loans.
Yeah.
And you didn't. You kept going, and you deferred salary. And then I think but luck, I think also, right, plays a huge role. Because had you not sold that company, let's say, God forbid, back then you had a bad taste in your mouth, something happened, like, that could have, put you in a different category. Maybe you've gone back to training, but it didn't. It worked out, and then you continue to do what you did. And I'm sure this attitude really helps because you're just constantly learning and evolving, and that's really critical.
Right. No, true. And the other thing I'd say along those lines is it's never a straight line.
Never.
Right. I think sometimes people have this notion that you join a VC firm or you start a company or you join a company and it's, 2 years later, you're going to get bought for $5 million, whatever. It's almost never like that. I mean, those are really the exceptions. And for me, I think I've derived a lot of pleasure in getting involved with something that was new and different and therefore not straightforward, and working on it and building it. And I think over our professional lives, which are finite, like we don't live to be 300, right? So over our professional lives, I think it's important to work on something consistently and persistent. And at the end of the day, you can say, you know what? I built this. I worked hard. I built this from the ground up.
Yeah.
And look at it now.
Yeah. There's a lot of fulfillment there. I see in your eyes, man. That's great. Good for you. Well, it's a pleasure. I know you got to jump on a call. We always end our sort of sessions, and most of it you've already covered. But if you were to highlight some things that are really pretty mandatory, if you were to pass that down to young entrepreneurs who are in your shoes, what would you give them?
Well, definitely the networking piece. Talk to as many different people as you can. See what excites them. See what makes their eyes light up. You've got to take risks. You've got to get out there and somehow get your foot in the door. It's not always comfortable. It's not always clear cut. But risk is part of life. You're going to fail. There are hurdles. You're going to make mistakes. But I just remember an interview I had once, and the guy said, I don't want to hear about your successes. I only want to hear about your failures. And his point, I think, was we learn more from failures. And I think as an entrepreneur or someone who's building a business, you got to get comfortable with that because, as I said, it's never a straight line. And then finally, hard work. We all have to keep at it. We all have to work 16-hour days sometimes or all day sometimes.
Yeah.
But the combination of all that, and as you said, with a little bit of luck rolled in, good things will happen.
Yeah, good, man. Hey, we're at the half point, and I know you got to run. It's just such a pleasure. I'd love to hopefully see you at one of the meetings. Hopefully next year. I don't know. We'll see. They're talking about Hawaii and I now. I just saw a note that Hawaii and I may go. I don't know. We'll see. But I'd love to get Craig and yourself, maybe hopefully in person. I'm done with these Zoom meeting stuff. Maybe. Get together for actual drink, and I salute you, man. Congratulations on all the work you've done. It's great, tremendous.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate again the opportunity to be here today.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on another episode. If you're not already a loyal follower of the podcast, please click subscribe and give us a rating. Also, be sure to sign up for our complimentary innovation showcases at OIS.net.